We're not racists, we're not bigots, we're not misogynists. We are human beings too that care about probably a lot of the same issues that liberals do on some levels, maybe a lot of levels.
We have got to start talking to each other.
Republicans for 40 years have tried to convince black voters that the GOP is okay. Donald Trump has completely blown up everything on that front. Hispanic voters, he's completely blown up the bridge on that point. And I'm wondering if the brand is so damaged beyond repair that there needs to be a new political party that's not associated with the sins of the Republican Party.
Hi, I'm Maggie Haberman. I'm a presidential campaign correspondent for The Times. Joined by Margaret Hoover, who I want to describe everybody's titles correctly, political activist, commentator, and author, president of the American Unity Fund, and Peter Wehner, senior fellow, Ethics and Public Policy Center, contributing opinion writer for The Times, and most importantly, a member of the last 3 Republican presidential administrations. So you just saw that very cheerful video about the Republican Party. We're here with 2 people who were not Trump supporters. I want to start with you, Margaret. Basically take us to the reaction that you had when you realized Donald Trump was going to be the nominee.
Well, I could tell you the real story, which is that I was having a C-section
Don't
last October and argued with the anesthesiologist that Donald Trump would never be the nominee of the Republican Party, and that frankly got me through the birth of my daughter. Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. Do what you have to do.
You know, it was really, so I had this maternity leave and I got to Iowa, and it was when I was on the ground in Iowa, and I spent a lot of time in Iowa. The Herbert Hoover Presidential Library is there, and I go there quite a bit to do work with them. And I realized many, prominent business leaders who I respect and who have been long-term Republicans were gonna caucus for Donald Trump. Really serious people whose opinions I respect, and that's when I realized this is real.
Peter, there was a tremendous public break with the Republican Party, in essence, by the Bush family. Right. Describe the experience of watching that up close and your own experience in processing Donald Trump.
Sure. I worked with George W. Bush in his White House for 7 years, and I worked in the first Bush administration as well as the Reagan administration. It didn't shock me that President Bush didn't vote for Donald Trump, or indeed the rest of his family. And the reason it didn't shock me is because I think Donald Trump is the antithesis of so much of what they believe. I mean, they believe in politics, they believe in governing, they believe in human decency. And they believe in a very different vision of the Republican Party. I remember being in the Oval Office actually with President Bush. It was probably about 2006, it was about 10 years ago. And he would talk about what his concerns were as they related to the Republican Party. And he talked about nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. And so he had a sense that some of these darker forces were brewing.
What was happening at that point? Do you remember in policy in real time?
Yeah, I mean, there were several things. There was the comprehensive immigration reform, which had almost passed but did not. And the reason it didn't wasn't because of Democratic opposition, it was because of the Republican. There was a revolt within the Republican Party against it. Now, look, I understand the substantive arguments against comprehensive immigration reform. That's perfectly fine, but I think there were darker elements that were, and uglier elements, frankly, that were motivating that. They were emerging then. They have now broken out, and they have now overtaken much too large a section of the Republican Party. As for isolationism, of course, that was when Iraq was not going well. So you saw those feelings emerge.
Margaret, at the end of the 2012 presidential campaign, there was what was known as an autopsy. I think it was more formally known as the Growth and Opportunity Report that the Republican National Committee did. It was a dissection of what went wrong in the 2012 presidential race, and the only policy prescription they came up with was that the comprehensive immigration reform was crucial for the Republican Party in order to grow with Hispanic voters. I would say that the last 2 years have not quite gone that way. If we wake up tomorrow and Donald Trump is not president, what does the Republican Party do to sort of both fix itself, and this is to both of you, fix itself and try to appeal to an emergent group of voters that is really awakened in this campaign?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 questions there. First, I mean, intimately familiar with the autopsy report. I actually even wrote a book in 2011 about connecting the Republican Party to the millennial generation, and I said the same things the autopsy report said. I mean, some of this has been clear to many of us for a very long time. And what we know is there aren't enough Republican voters to elect a Republican president or to win on a national level. We simply don't have enough of us, so we know we have to grow, right? We know we need more people.
You mean traditionally white, older,
No.
working class? or you just mean
Self-identified
actually
Republicans. There
self-identified
actually aren't
Okay.
enough of us.
Okay.
And also what we know is that people who are Republicans tend to be older, whiter, more rural, and people who tend to self-identify as Democrat or vote Democrat tend to be younger, not white, and live in urban areas. And so, you can't win by grabbing a bigger share of a shrinking pie. You need to grow the tent. So this has been abundantly clear to many of us for a long time. I will say about the Growth and Opportunity Report, or even about President Bush, who won 44% of the Hispanic vote in 2004. Right. He didn't run on comprehensive immigration reform, but he ran with a really authentically sincere outreach to Hispanic Americans that was convincing. And that translated for him into an effort to implement comprehensive immigration reform. But more than the thing that's so despicable about this campaign is the tone and the tenor that it's taken and created between and amongst fellow Americans. So it's not, I don't think, if policy prescriptions would be great, but I don't think that it doesn't start with policy prescriptions. It actually starts with sort of how we embrace and confront and internalize and deal with our fellow Americans.
What is the first step toward fixing the discourse, toward healing, essentially, after this?
In terms of the Republican Party, well, I think there's two things that have to happen. One is the Republican Party has to rid itself of Donald Trump, which I hope happens starting tonight and tomorrow morning. And then
How confident are you that a loss means that the Republican Party is done with Donald Trump?
Well, it's better than a victory, I'll say that. And it depends, frankly, on how much he's defeated by.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
My own hope is, frankly, as a Republican, is that he is repudiated and badly defeated, because I think what he is and what he stands for needs to be repudiated. He is acid. He's acid to the Republic, which I care about most of all, but he's also acid for the Republican Party. So I think it has to rid itself of him. That's the first. And there's a question, even if he loses, whether he hangs around and becomes an irritant or worse. But beyond that, it has to rid itself of the stain of Donald Trump, and that is a much more complicated thing.
Actually, Becky, let me jump in with a question on that. So let's say it's tomorrow morning. Let's say Donald Trump hasn't won. What is the first thing that Paul Ryan should get up and say to the nation in order to retain those voters who did, because 40% of this nation is going to vote for Donald Trump tonight, and expand the party? It's a hard line to walk.
Yeah, I think it's an impossible line to walk, frankly. So I wouldn't envy Paul Ryan if he had to. Look, I could give you a whole list of things that Paul Ryan should tell Donald Trump to say and do. That's not the problem. The problem is Donald Trump won't say and do those things because he doesn't believe it. And this just goes to a point, and Paul's a good friend of mine. I worked with him in the 1990s. I admire him very much. There was a problem with Republicans who embraced Donald Trump, and that was that they kept convincing themselves that he would become, quote unquote, more presidential. And he couldn't. And I said a long time ago, and I believe it's been vindicated, that the central thing to understand about Donald Trump is he has a disordered personality. And if you do not understand that, none of what he said makes sense. And if you do understand it, it fits together. And that's why, for all of the policy discussions, in my estimation, having worked with the president in the White House, worked in 3 administrations, the central thing for a political leader and a president is temperament, is prudence, is equanimity, is that sort of combination of character traits in a very deep way. And with Donald Trump, it's not only that he's worse than Hillary Clinton, he's worse than anybody we have ever seen. And that.
So you like the guy, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You were going to say.
And so I want to say one more other thing on the Latino point. I mean, it's hugely tragic that Donald Trump has come to embody the Republican Party and the Republican tradition, especially vis-a-vis Latinos, because you've got a lot of Republicans down ballot who actually have these extraordinary reputations in terms of reaching out and connecting with the Hispanic community. You've got Mike Kaufman, who's in a swing district in Colorado, for example, who debated, white guy, learned Spanish and debated in Spanish. Okay, you have Carlos Curbelo, Marco Rubio, all these, Republicans who are in lesser positions have actually done precisely what the autopsy report has said: reach out, grow the party, be Big Tent. But sadly, Donald Trump has come to represent what the Republican Party stands for when he is, but this sort of outlier of what the majority of Republicans, or what I would say sort of like-minded Republicans, moderate Republicans, want to be and have tried to make the party.
There's also, and the bucket of Donald Trump supporters often get thrown into one pile. There are, members of the alt-right movement who have been pretty racially incendiary. And then you have a group of working-class white voters who have seen jobs disappear and are concerned. How does the Republican Party appeal to one and sort of rid itself of the other, which I have heard is a concern from a lot of people?
Yeah, look, I think it has to do both. And there were a group of people, Reform conservatives, I was part of that, Margaret was, which said, even long before Trump got on the political stage, that Republicans were out of touch with middle class and blue-collar workers, and it had to come forward with an agenda to reach them. And I said during the 2012 campaign, there was more talk about electrified fences on the southern border than there was about higher education tuition costs. You're not going to win elections that way. So you do have to appeal to those people, and not all Trump supporters are by any means racist and nativist. But I will say this, everybody that supported him supported a person who is a racist and a nativist and a misogynist, and that is a problem. But you do have to appeal to these people, because there was a sociologist at UC Berkeley who wrote a really wonderful book called Strangers in Their Own Land. She went to Louisiana. And it tried to understand these people who feel like their stories have not been heard and their suffering has been ignored. And these are people who have been left behind in the modern economy, and they need to be addressed. But at the same time, you're going to have to produce leaders in the Republican Party who repudiate the worst elements of Donald Trump. And the person who has to do that has a very tricky task, because they have to, in one sense, pull in certain Trump voters. And yet, on the other hand, they have to go, in my estimation, hammer and tong against the leader of that movement because of all that he represents.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much.
Really
Thank you.
It has been a long night. We expected to be breaking in with a lot more breaking news, but absolutely nothing is becoming clear so far.
The state of suspended animation.
So it's going to continue to be a long night, but our final conversation to sort of put this into context very quickly from Carolyn Ryan,